Today is Tuesday, February 7th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm a little under the weather today with a sore throat, so I'm going to speak a little more slowly and quietly than normal. Today in my conversations with Catholic parents and friends, a topic came up that I wanted to think about, talk about, and get a hold of if I could. So let me provide a little context and then try to think through this in a helpful way. When I first became a Christian as a Protestant, I was 18 years old, and it seemed like there were many bizarre experiences in my life at that time. I was sort of waking up to thoughts of spiritual things, and there was a lot of fear and confusion about spiritual things. And one of the feelings that I had was a fear that there might be some kind of evil spirits that would do some harm to me. I remember one night in particular, around the time of my conversion, when I woke up in the middle of the night, and again, I was 18, 19 years old, and I felt, when I opened my eyes, when I woke up, I felt that there was someone hovering above me. And it felt as clear as day, but I got up and I remember my heart was beating, and I felt this sort of fright at this thought or this sight, whatever it was. I really don't understand, but there were many experiences like that where during that time of my conversion, I felt like spiritual things were going on in my life that I had never experienced before. There was one time when I was walking with some friends. We were in Princeton, New Jersey, and there was this woman sitting in a doorway. I don't know if I've ever shared this story, but there was a woman sitting in a doorway in one of the stores as we were walking around town in Princeton, and there were dozens of people walking past, and as my friends and I approached this lady, she looked up at me. She was sitting on the step beside the sidewalk, and she looked up at me, and when we walked past, she looked at me and she hissed at me like an angry cat. And so there were just all of these weird experiences around the time of my conversion to Christianity. And so I was always interested in learning about spirits and demons and things like that. And I learned about them from Protestant sources. This sort of peaked a few years later, actually quite a number of years later. I guess it was around 2004, so I would have been almost 30 years old. My daughter Elizabeth was 3 years old She's my oldest daughter, my second oldest child. She was 3 years old, and one day when I was at work teaching, my wife called the office at the school and told them that my daughter had a seizure and she was being taken to the emergency room. And it turned out that my daughter had a seizure. She was 3 years old. She had a seizure that would not stop. It went on for hours. And the seizure was so intense that the paramedics and even the doctors in the hospital exhausted just about everything that they could do for her. And finally, she was just unconscious. And I remember when I got to the hospital, they actually had her in what looked like an aluminum cage. And she was asleep. They had finally gotten her to go to sleep, but she was in a cage, and she was this beautiful little girl. And I remember the doctor telling me, first of all, our pastor, we were Anglicans, our pastor met me in the hallway when I arrived, and he was red-eyed from crying. And I had no idea what was going on. But when everything finally calmed down, they told me the details about the seizure that she had, and how there would very likely be permanent mental damage caused by the severity of the seizure and the drugs that she was given to try to make it stop. And so as she started to come out of this drug-induced sleep, we brought her home, and she was delirious and sedated still. And I remember sitting there thinking, I have no idea if she's going to recover from this. And she was a beautiful, smart little girl. And it was at that time in my life, and again, I was an Anglican at that time, I was a Protestant, and I felt that I just don't have, and this was my thought at the time, so forgive me if it sounds ignorant, but I felt that I just don't have the spiritual armor for this kind of stuff. It's one thing if the devil was going to attack me, but I never really thought about the possibility that the devil could attack my children. And it had a very sobering effect on me, and I remember thinking, I don't have the weapons for this warfare. I don't feel like I'm equipped for this. This is too much. I can take it. I can handle all kinds of trials and things like that. But if these attacks are going to come against my children, this is a totally different ball game. And as soon as I was saying those things and thinking those things, I thought of the story of Job, whose children were attacked by the devil and killed in Scripture. So I knew that this was very possible. And it was that experience of my daughter's seizure, that really pushed me in the direction of Catholicism, because I felt as a Protestant, I don't have the weapons for this fight that I feel like I'm entering into. And I remember what I did at that time was I got a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict just because it popped into my head and I was thinking about what I could do. I got a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict and I started making the sign of the cross. And it's hard, if you're a Catholic, it's hard for you to realize that Protestants don't do these things. They don't use what are called sacramentals in the Catholic Church. But I started making the sign of the cross on myself and also on my children. When I'd put them to bed or leave for work, I'd make the sign of the cross because I felt that I needed help. I needed protection from these things. And like I said, that was the beginning, one of the influences where I began to look to Catholicism because I felt that Catholicism had answers for these things. And so I've always been interested in church teaching on angels and demons, on the devil, and so on. And I think many of us are interested in these things because if there are, well, let me just say this. The desire for wisdom leads us to want to understand the causes of things. If causes are entirely physical or material, well then I want to know that, so I seek out the physical causes of different things that I'm concerned about. But if it's possible that the causes of things that we experience are not physical, are not material, but maybe supernatural or spiritual, well, it would obviously be very important for us to understand that. To understand what could be the sources or influences of different things we experience. So obviously it's necessary for us to understand those things. To understand what influence angels and demons could have in our lives. And I'm not saying this as a superstitious kind of person. I was a pre-med student. I was a classicist. I studied philosophy and languages. I knew the scriptures fairly well. I was not a superstitious person. I tend to rely more on philosophy and human prevention than turning to spiritual explanations. But if there are supernatural influences in our lives, obviously we need to study to understand these things so we can respond to problems that arise or trials or even blessings, not necessarily all evil things, so that we can respond to them in an intelligent way. And so I came into Catholicism wanting to understand more and was fascinated by the Church's teaching about angels and guardian angels and demons and so on. And of course, as a Catholic, one quickly learns about exorcists and exorcisms and experiences that saints had with evil spirits and things like that. So all of this was an interest of mine as I entered into Catholicism. And I started to study the Catechism pretty constantly, not just the modern Catechism of the Catholic Church, but also the Baltimore Catechism. And as I studied, I started to realize, and this is really my point in this talk today, I started to realize that I was no longer a Protestant living my own individual religious experience or journey. I was no longer an individual seeking salvation on his own. It was no longer Jesus and me. What I learned from the Catechism was that the Church is the means of our salvation. The Church is the source of our protection from these things, and everything that belongs to the Catholic faith, the faith itself, the prayers, the devotions, the sacraments, the sacramentals I mentioned before, all of these things have as their source the Church herself. All ordered in obedience under the Pope, the successor of St. Peter. And it was the primacy of the Pope that was another important influence in my conversion to Catholicism. But I started to understand how different the Catholic worldview or the Catholic view of salvation was from the Protestant view. In the Protestant view, it's how can I individually be saved from all evils? Whereas as a Catholic, I was learning that the Church was like Noah's Ark. The Church was the source of our safety. And everything that was necessary for our safety was provided for us in the Ark. And it was very different than Protestantism. It was a priestly religion. And so just because I'm a Catholic, I am already protected. I'm protected by the prayers of the saints. I'm protected by a guardian angel. I'm protected by the prayers of the Holy Father, of my bishop, of our parish priest, and so on. It was no longer just me against the devil. It was no longer me and Jesus. It was me in the Church. And I started to understand that all of the craziness and individualism of Protestantism didn't have some great answer in Catholicism. It was simply taken away in Catholicism. My salvation, my spiritual safety and protection were not simply in my own control, but I was also protected by all of the merits and virtues and prayers and sacrifices of the Catholic Church herself, both on the ground, militant today, and also triumphant among the saints already in heaven. And what I learned was I simply needed to obey the Church and stay within the protection of the Church. And that this salvation, because of the grace of God given to me through the Church, this salvation was actually much simpler and easier and more wonderful than I ever understood as a Protestant, where for all the talk about salvation by faith alone, my salvation day by day depended entirely on my work. The grace of the Catholic Church can be seen most clearly in the sacrament of baptism when it's administered to an infant. The Church giving this protection and pledging this protection to an infant who's not even yet aware of his surroundings or what's going on. That's the difference, the essential difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. For all the talk about grace and faith and love in in Protestantism, there really is very little grace in Protestantism. Now, the reason why I bring all this up is because over the past year or so, I've heard a lot from Father Ripperger about exorcism and evil spirits and demons and all these things. And I see that he's got a great following. And I just want to make it clear that I enjoy Father Ripperger's teaching very much. So anything that I say that comes across as negative, I just want to make sure that I'm very clear up front that I've enjoyed and benefited from Father Ripperger's teaching, and I admire him very much. So I don't want this taken as any kind of negativity towards Father Ripperger. I want to make a very simple point, and I want to make sure that this isn't misinterpreted or twisted out of the context. Again, I enjoy the teaching of Father Ripperger very much. I found many of the things that he's explained to be very helpful. But I think there's two different images. I don't know if that's the right word. Two different camps or groups of people that relate to Father Ripperger and this talk about exorcism and exorcists and demons and things like that, demon possession, all of this talk about spiritual life. There's two different kinds of people. There are some people who are faithful Catholics who want to understand the role of evil spirits within the context of Catholic teaching. They're seeking this understanding in a healthy way. They're living the sacramental life. They're seeking to be obedient to the hierarchy of the Church. And they're simply seeking to understand more clearly how the Church relates to this invisible world that certainly influences their lives. And I consider myself to be a member of that camp. But there's another camp that I see that seems to use Father Ripperger as a diving board to launch into the kind of spiritual craziness that I was familiar with in Protestant circles. More of this me against the devil spiritual life. It's very individualistic. And they use this talk, they pull things from Father Ripperger's talks, they take ideas and they run with them beyond the context and even beyond the words of Father Ripperger. And by the time they're done, they've got an entirely different set of teachings and practices, an entirely different spirit than Father Ripperger has ever communicated or promoted. They've basically used some of the ideas presented by Father Ripperger as a means to establish this individualistic, superstitious talk about demons and evil spirits. And they're fascinated with these things, but it's a fascination that's disconnected from the church. And as with Protestantism, it's very individualistic. The view they seem to have is that this life is like a run through dark woods, and the devil is like a hunter in the woods. Or these evil spirits are they're like the Black Riders in Lord of the Rings, sort of hidden all through the dark woods, and Christians are moving through these woods, hiding from these Black Riders, these demons. And these demons have traps laid for them all over the place, and the Christians have to be careful to not run accidentally into any of these traps, because if they do, they can become subject to all of these powers of the demons. And it's this message of a spiritual battle between me and the devil. And again, this is very much like Protestantism and very little like Catholicism. And I see in this, as I hear this, and again I'm sensitive to it because of my Protestant background, it's like hearing an old familiar voice. It seems that this worldview, this me against the devil worldview, doesn't have a respect for the role of the church and of the sacraments and of the sacramentals and other ordinary Catholic practices that have been given to us to keep us safe from all these things. And we are not actually like men in a dark wood, hiding and running for our lives, fending for ourselves against these invisible menaces that seek us in the darkness. That's actually not a fair image of the Catholic life. Because the church provides us with safety. The church provides us with light. It's as if the church carries us through that forest. And within the church, there is safety. It's like driving through a battlefield in an armored tank rather than walking on foot or driving in an ordinary civilian vehicle. Being in the church, we're safe. Living in obedience to the commandments of the church, we're safe. And this is the significance of the commandments of the church, is that they are the rules or the conditions on which our safety depends. We're not in the woods on foot by ourselves, surrounded with demons. We're in the church, and the church is bringing us through the dark woods of this life, to use this illustration that I guess is in my head because of Dante's Divine Comedy. But the church carries us through this life in safety. And Christ came into the world to establish this church, just as Noah built an ark to save his family from the flood. Now, when I listen to Father Ripperger, I hear something that I think is very different from what others seem to hear. Father Ripperger often gets into pretty profound discussions about spiritual things, spiritual conditions that people get themselves into. And if we were to stop the lecture at different points, we would walk away with a message that's completely different than what Father Ripperger's message usually ends up being. And usually, after going through all of these details and all of these interesting discussions and even first-hand accounts of things like exorcisms and amazing things that he's experienced as an exorcist, he usually ends the talk with, but if you're practicing the Catholic faith, if you're participating in the sacramental life, if you're living within the commandments of the church, you really don't have to worry about these things. And that part of the talk seems to get cut off when many people listen to his talks. The same thing happens, just by way of comparison, the same thing happens with the teaching of Saint Hildegard on medicine. Everything that Saint Hildegard teaches on medicine is always taught in the context of the sacramental life of the church. For Saint Hildegard, the soul and the body are one. And the health of one depends upon the health of the other. They can't be separated. And so Saint Hildegard is not like a modern agnostic physician who went to medical school and studied physical things and considers every physical symptom to have some physical cause, which is false. Saint Hildegard is a Catholic who considers the conditions of the body within the broader context of the condition of the human person as a creature composed of body and soul, indivisible. And often Saint Hildegard's writings on medicine will be naturalized. Her spiritual teaching will be edited out, and there will be an abridged version presented that includes only the part that talks about the physical remedies or causes of things. And what happens to the teachings of Saint Hildegard seems to happen also to the teaching of Father Ripperger. The talk about demons and spirits and demon possession and the other conditions of these evil influences seems to be separated from what Father Ripperger teaches about the ordinary practice of the Catholic life. Going to Mass, going to confession, praying the Rosary, living in obedience to the precepts of the Church, and so on. The ordinary Catholic life seems to be cut out of the messages, and we're left with this bizarre, superstitious, me against the devil, Protestantish, individualistic, spiritual teaching that really is not coming from Father Ripperger. Recently, one of these discussions came up where someone said, and I don't know if this is true or not, but someone said that Father Ripperger said that if a woman leaves her home to work, and there's not a grave reason for doing so, that she commits mortal sin. And when I heard that, it just didn't feel like something that a Catholic would say. A Catholic as intelligent as Father Ripperger. Because there are two different views of mortal sin among Catholics. Some people talk about mortal sin like certain acts or certain sins are intrinsically mortal. And we'll hear something like, looking at pornography is a mortal sin, or fornication is a mortal sin. And this really isn't what the Church teaches about mortal sin. The Church doesn't say that a mortal sin is a certain kind of sin or a certain matter. What the Church teaches is that there are three conditions that cause a sin to be mortal. And I know this is taught explicitly in the Baltimore Catechism, so this isn't you can't blame this as being some modern change in teaching. This is in the Baltimore Catechism. There are three conditions of mortal sin, and I think they're pretty widely known by Catholics. For a sin to be mortal, it has to be concerned, first of all, with grave matter. It's got to be some serious offense. And by serious offense, we're talking about breaking the 10 Commandments, for example. So it's got to be serious. Secondly, it's got to be done with understanding. The person has to understand the nature of the act for it to be mortal in that person's committing of that sin. It's got to be grave, it's got to be done with understanding, and thirdly, it's got to be intentional. The person has to understand that what he's about to do is sinful and is seriously sinful, and he's got to choose to do it anyway. It's got to be willful, with understanding, and grave. Those three conditions are what distinguish a mortal sin from a venial sin. A mortal sin destroys the grace of God in the soul. It separates us from God. It's like a divorce. It's a willful and intentional turning away from God. Or I should say turning against God. Willful, with understanding. In a serious matter, not something we just stumble into. And so someone doesn't just slip into mortal sin. It destroys a person's relationship with God, and it ends one's life in the grace of God. And the only way that it can be remedied is through the sacrament of confession. Because the relationship is broken. The person needs to be reconciled with God through penance. It's a voluntary, serious sin that's committed with understanding. And therefore, it's impossible for us to just point at any action and say, oh, that's a mortal sin, that's a mortal sin, especially when we're talking about other people. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to point to someone else and say, hey, you just committed a mortal sin. Because we don't know what the other person understands or what the other person intends. We see this reflected in human law. If a woman commits adultery on her husband and he is moved by anger in response to her evil, he's provoked to anger and he gets into a fight with this other man, and in that anger and rage he kills that other man. The state normally doesn't consider that to be a free and willful action. They consider it to be an action that was committed without deliberation and under the influence of a great provocation that was not in the man's control. So the state respects the conditions in which an action is carried out. And this distinction between mortal and venial sins is similar to what we see even in human law. That's why it's always funny to hear Protestants criticize the Catholic teaching about mortal and venial sin when Protestant countries have established laws that teach the same thing. But it's impossible for us to say, oh, Frank over there committed a mortal sin. Mortal sin is our own business. And the only mortal sins that it seems that we should be talking about in the Catholic life are our own. If we ourselves commit such a sin, and by grace seek to be reconciled to God. Again, God is not out to trip us up or to catch us in a net. He doesn't send us into the woods filled with demons to try and destroy us or cause us to be damned. The scriptures teach us that it's God's will that everyone be saved. God said, or in the gospel, that the gospel of Christ was to go out to be preached to every creature. It was his will that every creature, every person should hear the message of salvation and be given the opportunity, the invitation to come and be saved. God sent his Son into the world to help us. God revealed himself through prophets and apostles to help us. In our weakness, God comes to us and helps us. He desires for us in our own freedom to choose to respond to him and seek the salvation that he makes available to us. And again, this is seen nowhere more perfectly than in infant baptism. That's the Catholic faith. It's not this religion where individual wretched souls are left unprotected in a dark wood to be hunted by demons. It's not a religion where people seeking to do good slip almost as if it were by fate, like Oedipus Rex, into evils, into destruction, against their will, as they seek to do good. That view of religion is fatalistic. It's not Christian. We're not in this world by ourselves, left constantly in danger of slipping by accident into mortal sin and being possessed by demons. In order for us to suffer evil, spiritual evil, we have to will it, or this world simply wouldn't be just. And it's this unjust, I want to say dualistic, because I think that the ancient heresy of dualism is at the root of this view of the spiritual life, where it's sort of this ongoing battle, this uncertain, perilous battle that rages on between God and his adversary, the devil. And it just denies the reality that the battle was never really a battle between God and the devil. It was a battle between the devil and man. And it was a battle that God chose to settle himself by becoming a man and crushing the serpent under his foot. And when Christ was crucified, he said, "It is finished." The battle was over. And the battle is over. There's no dualistic battle between good and evil. Good has already conquered evil, and it's just a matter of time for the fruits of that salvation to bear themselves out. It's like a farmer who's plowed his crops, fertilized his soil, got everything ready, planted good seed. Everything is done. All the work has already been completed, and it's just now a matter of time for those seeds to germinate and grow and bear their fruit. The work has already been done. The harvest is already anticipated and provided for. And we live not in this terror that some black rider is around the corner to get us. We live comforted by the hope of the protection and safety that Christ has provided to us in his church. And it may seem subtle, but it's actually a very great difference in worldview between one perspective and the other. And it has an infinite number of practical implications. When we look at the world as a place that Christ has overcome, where the fruits of eternal life are slowly being born through time, versus looking out at the world as this dark forest full of invisible menaces that have traps laid for us everywhere, and one misstep, unintended, can cause our spiritual ruin. Those are two very different worldviews. And I think this talk about evil spirits and demons, and it often gets pulled out of its true Catholic context and turns into this individualized, dualistic, miserable, superstitious, false religion. And I see this quite frequently when I see people talking about Father Ripperger said this, Father Ripperger said this. You have to be careful because you're in danger of being possessed by demons because of this or that, or because you accidentally look at this and talk to this person and this person puts you under a spell. We cannot lose our salvation because of the malice of someone else. We're in control of our salvation. It's a matter of our own will. When St. Thomas Aquinas was asked, "What must I do to be a saint?" he said, "You must will it." There'd be no use advising someone of that if it wasn't true, because some witch who lives down the road could cast a spell on you and cause you to lose your salvation. God is gracious. It's His will that we be saved. We're protected by a guardian angel. We're protected by all the prayers and sacraments of the Church, all the merits of the saints and of Christ Himself. And I think we have to be careful to guard ourselves against this cowardly, fearful, superstitious twisting of Catholic teaching on demons, and make sure we read everything and listen to everything. Careful to listen to what someone like Father Ripperger actually teaches, because as I said, he makes these distinctions, and I think people cut them out to satisfy their desire for some kind of exciting, superstitious craziness. So as we talk about these things, I encourage you to go back and listen to Father Ripperger and pay attention to the efforts that he makes to clarify that all of these dangers of the spiritual life are already provided for in the ordinary Catholic life, in keeping the precepts of the Church, in going to Mass, in making good confessions, and so on. These things are already provided for. And you can see how this individualized religion feeds into this popular rebellion against the Pope and bishops, where individual Christians think that they are the keepers of tradition and they have to resist the authority. If there's anyone who's in danger of spiritual ruin, it would be those people who are actually fighting against and even in some cases separating themselves from the Church herself, because they've been deluded to think that they as individuals are in a better place spiritually than the Church herself. That's the spiritual danger. Stepping outside of the safety of the Church and thinking that you can swim on your own in the floodwaters. So I hope that that's helpful. I hope that you're not affected negatively by any kind of superstitious fear of undeserved evils, that the Catholic life is some kind of fatalistic Greek tragedy that happens where good men meet their unavoidable evil end, no matter how hard they try to do good. That's not true religion. That's pagan fatalism. And I recommend that you read the story of Oedipus, the famous Greek tragedy. Read the story of Oedipus, and you'll see how Oedipus lives as a model of fate, where no matter what a good man tries to do, it's just been willed by the gods that he should fall. And understand that that's a pagan idea. That is not Christian teaching. So I hope that's helpful. God bless.